Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our second session of When HR Meets GDPR. So today's session, we're going to be talking about data and the data culture within organisations. Before we get started on this subject, which I think is a fascinating one, Christina, did you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'll do a brief introduction. So first of all, apologies everybody. I have a stinking cold, so if you hear me sniffing, apologies in advance. So I'm Christina from CVG Solutions, and I am a multi-award winning GDPR or data protection, whichever you prefer, professional. And I work primarily with small and medium-sized businesses. I really like to see them thrive, and so I tend to gravitate towards them. I have a hands-on, practical and proportionate approach to my clients, which is based on their size and complexity. And I also use proven methodologies and best practices that I have acquired during my 25 years careers working in some of the largest corporations on the planet. I help my clients by educating them on this big subject that is GDPR. There is still a lot of misconception and misunderstanding about it. And obviously education then empowers them to make informative decisions. As they say, knowledge is power. In turn, this enables them to operate with a high-performing culture which fuels their business growth. So it's all about educating, empowering, and enabling. Julie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Julie from BU Consultancy and Coaching. And like Christina, I truly believe in empowering people. So I have a portfolio business where I have a HR consultancy, and that's providing ad hoc or regular support to customers, small, medium-sized businesses. But also I'm a confidence and leadership coach. So for me, again, it's really about that empowering, sharing the knowledge, talking things through, and looking for the right solution for the customer. I think that's the most important thing. And that's why I really enjoy these sessions where we've got that blend of HR and GDPR in the room.
Yes, absolutely. So just before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. We just want to make you aware that this session is being recorded and it will be used by both of us for promoting our services and also future LinkedIn Lives, which we'll let you know about it later at the end. So as Julie mentioned, today's topic is data culture. So let's explore what actually data culture means. So in very simple terms, data culture is the collective behavior and beliefs of people within an organization and using that data for their decision making. So it's based on common understanding and common values for the data. And so it's about using the existing data, so in other words, the facts, to make those decisions rather than relying on intuition, your gut feelings. So the culture or the data culture of an organization then impacts on how data is collected, analyzed, used, stored, deleted, etc. So with this in mind, I think it's important to look at the different types of organizational culture. I believe this is more your area of expertise, Julie.
Yeah, completely. And I think it's so important to have that awareness that the data culture and the culture of an organization is so entwined because, of course, without one, you haven't got the other. But the culture within the business really empowers and impacts how the data is handled within a business. So if we think of an autocratic style of organization, so that's really where you've got your management tiers saying, do as I say. If I say jump, how high? Thinking about the types of data and the culture that may be there might be very much a You can't challenge. This is the way we've done things. This is the way we've always done things. You need to follow me. If we think about democratic style of organisation, where we're asking people, well, what do you think? How do you feel? The data may be led on the consensus, but that may not be the right way to do it. A visionary style is doing as I do. So you're leading by example, you're a servant leader. And then we've got the coaching style. So the coaching style is the optimum one that actually empowers individuals. And it really, the style of coaching is really to empower individuals to get them to the next level, generate that high performance. If we think about that, that's where everyone wants to get to in terms of organizations and how people are led so that they can grow those ideas themselves. And when we think about the data, it really comes from that, where we're giving people the ownership to think for themselves.
Yes, I agree. And also, like you say, coaching or the coaching culture promotes continuous improvement, data quality, which then aids the high performing culture and business growth.
Yeah, definitely. So I know in our previous sessions, I've talked a fair amount about the pandemic, because I think that has changed how the influence that it's had on how we think, how we feel, how businesses actually interact with each other. So, Christina, do you think that the pandemic has impacted data cultures?
Most definitely. So obviously, during the pandemic, we, in order for organization to survive and carry on the business, there was a shift moving their employees of working remotely, in a remote location, most of the time from home. And those organizations with a coaching culture, they already had, as part of their core baseline, a trust element between employer and employee, and the empowerment of the employee to manage their workload. So working remotely was really not an issue, to be honest, while instead organization with an autocratic culture, I'll get it right in a minute, where the trust really is not there. So they do not trust their employees. And so what they did, because they had no choice but to allow them to work from home, they started to monitor them in quite really invasive ways, such as keystrokes, such as activating the cameras on the laptop so that they could watch them, or insisting that they would have the camera on while on Zoom or team calls. So apart from the fact that they're collecting personal data, they're also invading the privacy, but these practices that actually led to organization collecting data, which, as I said, in some time was also personal data, sharing it inappropriately, monitoring and tracking their employees, invading their privacy. And this type of behavior that actually leads to bad data culture, collecting disproportional data, both in terms of volume and type, for the sake of collecting it. So in other words, without purpose or without proportionality. So this is really goes to demonstrate the two different cultures, where the coaching one not only has a respect for their employees and their staff, but also for the data itself. While the autocratic one, it's all about control, not just of the people, but also of the data, and that leads to disproportionate effort and collection, manipulation of the data. And actually, one primary example is the post office. What does the post office tells us about his data culture, Julie?
So if we think about the post office, and I'm sure many of you have seen the TV show that ITV aired with regards to Mr. Bates, one thing that's come through for me is how they handled the data and the messages that they were saying to those postmasters in terms of, well, you're the only one, it's your fault. But actually, they were going in and changing the data overnight, and their systems were incorrect. So actually, if you think about the impact to how they're treating their data, and the impact then on the data with the culture within the post office, there's that mistrust, there's that autocratic, you're doing it wrong, but actually we're squirreling away and doing something different. The fact that they had to put it right with their own money is a whole different subject. But when we're thinking about the type of data culture that we have, how's that impacting our engagement levels in terms of staff, in terms of retention? Do they feel safe? Do they feel like their information is going to be protected? Or is it that they're just going to be told, well, just do it anyway? You've got it wrong, we've got it right. And I think that's such a huge thing, especially now when we're looking at individuals who are looking for so much more from organisations. They're not just looking to come in and do a 9 to 5. They're looking for that value add from the employer and actually holding the employer to account. So I do think there's so much we can learn from the post office when we think to how they've treated their data.
Yes, definitely. And, that autocratic culture, it leads to a blaming culture. There has to be someone that needs to be blamed rather than a solution-driven culture. Because if that's what the post office had, then they would have sort of looked at the issue. We got more than one person reporting this problem. Let's look at it. Where is the root cause of this? And also, the coaching culture allow people to question the status quo, while instead the autocratic culture, it's just accept the status quo, don't ask question, and data as a consequence, it's impacted by that.
Oh, definitely. And I think if we think of Simon Sinek in terms of the coaching, you always start with the why. So if the post office had that coaching culture within their data, it'd be like, well, actually, we've had someone say this happen. Right, let's start with the why. What's going on? Why is it happening? What does that mean? What does that look like? To unearth that answer rather than just, it's your fault, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And of course, hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Yes.
That's one to be added. But I think it's so valuable that we take time as individuals to learn from that, because we don't want to be the next ITV drama.
No.
Well, I certainly don't want to be. For our organisations. So, Christina, when it comes to data, what would be the top 5 points that you would suggest to people?
Okay, so the first one that comes to mind is records management. So know your data, classify your data, know the purpose of your data. Is it for internal use? Is it for external use? Or is it commercially confidential? Is it personal data? Is it finance data, etc. So classify that and create some kind of asset register. But I would also recommend quite strongly the use of naming convention to support that records management. And I always do that with all of my clients. So that means that the naming of your files or your documents is then standardized across your organization and across departments, because that, as I said, supports record management. Then another point would be to have ROPA. ROPA stands for Records of Processing Activities, which apart from being a requirement under the GDPR, it actually is a very useful tool to understand the data that you capture, that you use, what you're using it for, who you're sharing it with, how long you're retaining it, etc., etc. So it's a really, really great tool to have, and I use it all the time with my clients, and I support that with a data flow map that sort of shows at what point in the various processes the triggers of where the data is collected and what type of data is collected, because that gives you a holistic view, and I usually do it by process of what data you have so you can manage it. And the next one, it would be for me would be the minimization principle. So in other words, only collect what you need and no more. I mean, what the GDPR actually says is that if you can achieve whatever it is that you want to achieve without the use or collection of personal data, then you should do that first. So really question, do we need this data? Can we do this in a different way? Really question your processes and adjust them accordingly. Because the less personal data, or in general, but less personal data that you have, the lower your risk. Purpose and proportionality are also very, very important. So every data that is being collected, so every data point that you collect needs to have a purpose. Otherwise, why collect it? And it should be proportionate to the purpose. What do I mean by that? Well, a client of mine, they needed to create a map or like a demographic of where all of their clients were across the UK. But instead of collecting the full address, they just need the postcode, because it's just a map. They just need to know roughly where they are. So they didn't need to use the home address. They just needed to use the postcode. And then the final point, and I'm not sure whether it's number 5 or number 6, I've lost count, is data quality, which actually is really, really important. So make sure that you keep your data clean and accurate and up to date. Now, when I was working in IT management, data cleansing was always part of, as a key deliverable within any project. And in fact, we used to say the system will only be as good as the data that goes in. So rubbish in, rubbish out. So don't blame the system if the output, is not accurate. It doesn't give you the information that you want, because if you put in rubbish, you're going to get rubbish coming out. And with that in mind, actually, Julie, can you share with us some horror story that you've come across in your HR career with regards to data, obviously?
Yeah, the general horror stories. Before I do that, I must say, if people have got comments or questions that they want to ask, we have got some time at the end. But if you want to put them in either to the StreamYard or into LinkedIn Live, we'll go through them as many as possible towards the end. And also, if we've got HR people, their horrors as well. I'm always intrigued when it comes to data. Now, I'm going to caveat this with the fact that I've been in HR for over 24 years. So I have a few to tell. But I think the ones that I see come up the most are things called WOW lists or Uzi lists. And the WOW list is an acronym for waste of wages. An Uzi list of who do you want to get rid of, both inappropriate, both why are you collecting that information? Why are you writing it down? Now, when we say write it down, gone are the days of pen and paper in most organisations, but it's still text messages. It's still instant messages, emails, things like that, that can be used if requested for subject access requests. And what leaders, managers would do, add to the Uzi list, add to the waste of wages. Let's check on that. Now, the culture within the business was one that was light-hearted. It was focused in terms of getting things done. But imagine the impact if someone got hold of that list and they were on it, or a friend was on it. The impact to the organisation, to the engagement, the media damage that would be caused by that. And previously, I've had HR individuals pull out the Uzi list and say, let's have a look at this. I'm like, let's not. Don't want to know. Because I don't want my reputation to be damaged by that. But also, as an individual, I certainly know how I would feel if I was on that list. And I think once someone has been impacted by something like that or experienced it, they're not going to forget that. And you think of, you've been to a restaurant, you've had a bad meal. You tell as many people as possible, whether you mean to or not, you just do. And if we think about that for organisations, how quick that can spread, especially on social media. We've got Glassdoor, we've got other review sites where things can just spiral, and they can really damage organisations and their reputations. So whilst it sounds fun, it's not. The damage is too much, the risk is too great. So what I would suggest is if any of you know of any lists like that, get rid. Never talk about them again. Now, I did mention when I was talking about that subject access request. So, Christina, what kind of things do we need to think of? And what are subject access requests?
Okay, so SAR, which is SAR, which is short for subject access request. So it's when an individual, which could be your employee, it could be a customer, or even a supplier, ask for copies of their data. So that's roughly what that is. But they tend to come when you least expect it. So as an organization, you need to ensure that you have a robust process in place to deal with them in a way that is effective and efficient. You only have 1 month to turn it around, which, you might think, oh, we've got plenty of time. Actually, when you look closely at it, it isn't. So it's really important that your staff is trained on how to deal with subject access requests, how to recognize them, how to, to whom do they need to escalate to, etc. You want to look at your, like I said earlier, your data flow, you map your data flow in your system, because data could be in more than one system, and you got to retrieve all of that. Because SAR is not just about digging out, if you want, the emails that the requester has created, to colleagues or to customers, but also emails from other colleagues, so between them, that talked about, expressed an opinion about the requester. So because it's about them, it's about the requester, then it's in scope. Is looking at documents that might have the name or initial of the requester. As I said, opinion that has been expressed in disciplinary, in grievances, in performance review, all of that is in scope. Don't forget chats, you might have in Teams or WhatsApp or other systems. Because again, all of that, it's in scope. If it's about them, it's in scope. If it's got the name, the initial, etc. Biometric data such as photos, fingerprints, CCTV footage. So all of that, it's in scope. But as an organization under the GDPR, you also have the obligation to protect others from being revealed, from sharing that. So you've got to then redact all of the data. And it's not just about redacting their names or their initial or their email address. It's about removing opinion or comments that are about other people that are not the requester. It's also redacting, CCTV footage or photos. If you have a photo that has more than one person, the requester plus other people, then the other people need to be redacted. Potentially even voice recording needs to be redacted. So do you have the right system that allows you to do that? And do you have the right processes, and have your people been trained on how to deal with that, so that you can complete your turnaround within the 1 month deadline?
I think some really valid points there. And I certainly know when they introduced subject access requests, they attached a fee to the request of the information because everyone was so concerned that as soon as they allow people to access the data, there would be a flood of requests. Thankfully, certainly in the organisation I worked in, there wasn't, but it was thought that there really would be. But I think there's one obvious tell for me about the data culture within organisations is when you say you've had a subject access request, how grey or pale or sweaty do the people go when you tell them? Because if they do, you can guarantee there's something there that shouldn't be there.
Yes. So, and if we think of the instance that we had with Nigel Farage, he wanted to open a bank account with Kurt. Then he submitted a subject access request, and it was revealed it was a communication between two colleagues within the bank that sort of basically said, we're not going to accept his submission because of his political views. So that was exposed because of the subject access, because their comment was about him. So, so be careful what you write, I suppose, as well.
Because we don't want to terrify. But it's that education piece, isn't it? And I think when we think about instant messaging and WhatsApp, and I think generally social media, people are very, very quick to give their opinions without necessarily thinking things through. So where do we stand on instant messages, WhatsApp, where people are using? And I think there's those two parts, isn't there? Whether it's business or personal devices.
Yes. I mean, I would say, as an organization, choose a system, whatever that is, whether it's Team, whether it's WhatsApp or whatever, and stick with that. But also make sure that the business data, the personal data is kept in separate accounts. So, because obviously the data in terms of messaging, it's on the business account will be in scope for a SAR, while personal will not. So you want to keep that separate, because will then also make your life easier when it comes to dealing with the SAR and redacting. Now, WhatsApp is to me very popular for instant messages, and is also used for sharing documents, images, video, etc. While this particular app is end-to-end encrypted, so it's still relatively safe to do that, but you've got to remember that the backup is not encrypted, so you've got to encrypt it because it's not done automatically. So that means that you're still vulnerable. With Teams, because it's part of your Microsoft 365 infrastructure, so long as you've got the backup, which Microsoft doesn't provide, by the way, so speak to your IT provider, then those chats, those messages are backed up, so it's okay. But you need to check with your IT provider. Now, there is always the other thing that needs to be considered is many businesses allow the use of the best personal devices without putting in place a correct or appropriate control mechanism to control and contain the risk. So make sure that you have proper policies and procedures in place with regards to bring your own device. If it's a work WhatsApp group that is being created, who is authorized to be a member of that group? If someone else, say at a later stage, needs to be added to that group, what is the approval and authorization process or procedures for that? If a member of the group leaves, do you have, as part of your leaving procedures, the removal of this individual from that WhatsApp group or Teams group or whatever it is? I mean, this really happened last year, where NHS had a data breach because during COVID they had created a WhatsApp group for communicating while during those trying times, and the members of the group then they carried on using it after COVID, and then someone else was added to the group, and this individual was not authorized to actually have access to the medical information that was being shared in this group. And so this is one of the many of the NHS data breaches last year. But think of the fact that this breaks trust with your customers or patients, if you're patient, employees as well. So so think of that. So make sure that you have those robust processes. But also, when things like this happens, it makes you wonder what else is exposed, what else are you not protecting? What is your data culture as an organization? Do you care about your data, or do you, or you don't? Bearing in mind that GDPR or data protection is about protecting people from coming to harm through the use of their personal data. So data quality, data protection, is really, really important for any organization of any industry. And data is not just email and phone numbers. It's a lot more, and that's why that ROPA that I mentioned earlier, that data inventory and the data flow map really, really help you to really understand what data you are collecting, how you're using it, who you're sharing it with, what system is it in, so how you have that holistic overview of your organization, which will then also allows you to improve, and that leads to good quality data. Yeah, I suppose that is really what is at the core of it. And given what we just discussed, and something that I often get asked is, how can we measure the data culture?
So I think for me, with regards to the measurement of data culture, there's so many different ways that we can look at it. Whether we look at it as part of engagement surveys, and ask that question, how do you feel about the data? Do you think the data being collected is appropriate? Even if we are asking, do people know how long the retention periods are for data? Are we keeping things that we should be keeping, or are we just keeping things in case something might happen? I was talking with someone the other day about data retention, and actually they looked at a filing cabinet and said, oh, I think everyone's still in there that left. Like, right, let's discuss that, because actually that can lead to a lot of issues, because even there's the concern that the data isn't being treated properly. As we've mentioned throughout today, is thinking about your business culture and then thinking about the impact of what is the data culture. If you've got that autocratic style of leadership, is it likely that you're going to have a coaching style of data culture? Possibly not. And just because you've always done something doesn't mean that's the right thing to do. And I think when we're thinking of data, again, it's that overview, isn't there? There's so much data on everyone at the moment, and that's only going to get worse as we use more and more technology. I still refer to penning letters to people and writing. And you think, haven't done that for years. It's all online. It's all instant, and actually, all of that is data in itself. I think other ways we can measure data culture is by exit interviews, considering why people are leaving the business. Because if they're leaving for something to do with culture, there might be a tie into the data as well. But also, we're not saying go out and do anything new. Think about the data that you've already got that might give you an indication on how to measure it. Is it the best data culture that you can get for your organisation, or is it a starting point and you know you've got a journey to get to? I think all of these things are considerations that you need to have, rather than just thinking, right, we need to spend X amount on this process to get it right. What have you got? What is your data telling you? And what are your people telling you as well? It's a huge thing.
Yes, and again, build into your data culture the cleansing and of your data. So data quality is really, really important, because if you're using it to make informative decision, if the data is wrong or out of date, then the decision will be based on wrong information. So data quality is really, really really key. We've had a question coming through. And I think it's for you, Julie. What's your view on succession planning data and lists containing high potential employee details?
So for me, I think the view on it is that organisations need succession planning. They need to know who's sitting on the bench, who's going to be their next superstars. But I think it's reviewing and considering what data is being collected and why. So if you're looking at an individual and you're considering their development points, so what training you're going to put in place, what support they need to get to the next point, I think that's good. And I think it's valuable, and I think it can be argued that it's needed within the business. But I'd share that with that individual. I certainly know of organisations that will do succession planning, but then they don't talk to the individual about it. And where the trust can be broken is where there's information on you. You know there's information on you, but you don't know what it is. So it could be good, could be bad. And I don't know about the rest of you, but that little voice in my head tends to then come along and go, well, it must be bad. It can't be good. So therefore, I want to know about it and what if. And if that seed of doubt forms, then we start to have an issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I would say succession planning is really, really good, really vital for organisations. But thinking about what information you're retaining. And also, if you've got issues with, so if you're looking at part of your succession planning and you're looking at your high performers and your low performers, the low performers, again, be really mindful about what details you're taking, whether they go onto that WOW list, the waste of wages list, the USI list, the whatever other list there might be under the sun. And actually think about, right, what development do they need? Are there timelines that we need to consider? But again, feed that back to the individual. Make sure you're giving them that chance. Because if it's seen as supportive, of course, that's a completely different mindset to you trying to get me out of the business. Christina, I don't know if you'd add anything to that.
Just in terms of from a data protection perspective, GDPR does not prevent you from having this list, from having a succession planning. You need that, and I totally support that for the survival of your organization, to promote your employees, to ensure that you retain talent or you develop those that are underperforming, which sometimes underperforming for lots of different reasons, not just necessarily because they don't care. But what the regulation does, it does provide us with security measures. And so you could have those lists password protected, for example. You could put them in in an area that access is restricted just to those that need access to them. The other thing that you could do is use pseudomization. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but basically what it is you could remove some of the identifiers, like the name of the individual, and replacing it with an ID, so that should, for whatever reason, that list be mislaid or misplaced, and someone who's not authorized to see it, they would not know who those individuals on the list are. So, I'm not saying, carry on doing the succession planning. Succession planning is important, is vital. I would also actually say, just be mindful and make sure that you have the security measures around it to protect the data. Sorry.
Definitely. As you were saying that, I was thinking about, I had a very long debate with an individual with regards to anonymizing all data, taking all the data out of the HR system,
right,
anonymizing it all, including any ID,
right,
and then making sure that you could keep it up to date. And it was fascinating because my argument was, of course, you wouldn't know who's left the business, who's joined the business.
Yeah.
If you really anonymise, can't even say the word now.
Anonymization. I found them very difficult to say those words.
But I think it's that you still got to be able to use the data. You've got to be mindful of what data you're collecting, but if you're collecting it, it's got to be for a purpose. So you still got to make it usable.
Yeah,
and I think
yes, and if you are anonymizing the data, you're stripping it of all of the personal identifiers, so you're not going to know who's who. And in some instances, that is the right approach. Don't get me wrong. And in fact, under the GDPR, if the data is anonymized, it's actually out of scope because you can't identify who's who. But there might be instances like in a succession planning where anonymizing everything is probably not the right course of action. So anonymization might be a better approach.
Put luck on this succession, definitely. So when we're thinking about the data and getting it right, there's obviously a lot of considerations that we need to take on board. But what are the risks of getting it wrong?
Well, obviously, there is always a risk of getting something wrong. After all, we're human, and by the very nature, we're fallible. But this should not prevent us or stop us from putting measures in place. Getting it wrong is part of learning. It gives us in my opinion, the opportunity to put it right. So for me, is the doing nothing is actually worse. So because even if you get it wrong, at least you're trying, and then you're learning, and then you put it, you then change whatever you've done. You change. Say, well, that one didn't work. Let's try this way. But the doing nothing, for me, is actually, it's worse, really.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree with that. I think if you're aware of something and you do nothing, rightfully so, you're not doing the right thing for the business, the individual, or for you as a professional.
Yes, definitely.
So what happens? We go away from this discussion, rolled up, ready to go, thinking about the data management and the data culture. But what happens if the business we work in doesn't want to change?
Well, for me, then at that point, the business then needs to accept that doing nothing is a risk. And then, with any decision, then comes consequences. And then those consequences might be quite detrimental to the business, and they might not be able to recover. Now, it might not necessarily happen today or tomorrow, but it will eventually happen as more and more data is being used, as you said earlier, more and more systems are being used. So then their customers, their employees will then become more savvy about their data. And so they will look then at organizations that are, keeping up with the times, that actually care about the data and treat it with respect. So, I suppose the question is, can you really afford not to change, and do nothing, stay as you are? Or, I'm not saying that you should change dramatically, but maybe, little steps to get to where you need to be. If you can't face a big change, but sometimes breaking it down, it's the best way forward. But again, going back to what I was saying earlier, not changing, doing nothing, in this day and age is probably not the right course of action, and particularly obviously with data.
Yeah, and I think you're so right in terms of it's not just necessarily the risk right now.
Yes.
It's the risk now, but also what that risk looks like in the future. If we're thinking about risk, it isn't just based on someone doing subject access request.
No.
At all. But if we think about, again, we go back to the post office, and because it's such unfortunately, a good example of where data culture has gone wrong. If we think about post office, we think about their brand's been impacted, the publicity that they've had, the customers and the customers' engagement with the post office, potential legal action being taken, fines being taken, their supply chain being brought into question, let alone employee engagement and productivity. Yeah. And I think that's the thing. It's such a huge, for something that could be so straightforward in terms of the data and its process and how it's managed and the culture around it, the risk of it is so big if it goes wrong.
Yeah.
And I think it's something, as I say, we're constantly exchanging data all of the time. But how many times do we stop and think, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Is the best way to do it? Do I need to do this? What information am I retaining or sharing? Is it the right thing to do? I think there's so many areas that need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah.
So in terms of instant messaging, because I think for me as a HR person,
okay,
instant messaging always comes across and makes me quite nervous when someone says, I won't put it on email. I'll WhatsApp you about it.
Yeah.
That's one of those things that always gets me in a bit of a cold sweat of, here we go again. If we've got an issue with instant messaging within a business, what would you recommend being the immediate steps that we took?
Well, choose one system and stick to it, because otherwise you're going to have multiple systems to manage as well as data in multiple systems. So you need to control that, because using instant messaging, it's a risk. So you want to control that risk. Also ensure that it is used for work-related activities. Like I said earlier, make sure the accounts are kept separate. Issue the appropriate policies and procedures that gives the appropriate provision for those for using separate accounts for different purposes, and ensure that those processes and procedures are in place and followed. So you want to sort of do that through performance management. You want to ensure that those are in the objectives of the employees, and so that you're holding them accountable, and you're then moving towards a more coaching style culture rather than autocratic, where you're measuring them through their objectives rather than by sort of dictatorship, I suppose. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, and I think following up on that as well, if we think about the culture within businesses, sometimes it can be one rule for senior leaders and another rule for everyone else. Or, I mean, Christine, I can see you're nodding and sort of like, oh yeah, I get that. And I think that can be quite a common thing. Where culture and organisations go wrong is where you've got that divide and you've got that split, because it will never truly be one culture. Of course, if you've got two going on, it's the same for data. It's exactly the same. Yeah. So if you've got one half of the organisation taking the data culture really, really seriously, but you haven't got your top tier doing the same,
it's going to crumble. It's going to crumble, yeah.
It's never going to change. But it's that educating people rather than necessarily thinking about that autocratic style. It's that coaching style of, do we understand why we need to do this? What are the whys?
Yeah.
Explaining the risks, that then all you're trying to do is minimize them. I think it's the training, it's the communication of it and the continual communication of it.
Yeah.
And of course, data culture and organisations will only last if it's done throughout the whole business, rather than that split.
Yeah. You also don't want it compartmentalized either. You want it to be an overall across the entire organization. Obviously, the smaller you are, the easier it is. But then if you have it already and you can build on it as you're growing, you already have the foundation. If you are a bigger organization and you don't have that already, then it's a little bit challenge, but it's not an insurmountable challenge. It can be achieved. It might take longer. You might need to put additional effort into it. You might require to bring in some expertise to support you, but it's not insurmountable. As I said, it is all achievable. I think the willingness is the key. So long as you're willing and the top tiers is willing, everybody else will follow. But it is the top tier that needs to have that drive and that desire, because otherwise it's just not going to go anywhere, because it's like driving a car without an engine. It's not going to go far, is it?
That's such a good image. Such a good image. And of course, where can people get help on changing the culture?
Well, without sort of playing our drum, people like you and me, come to us. We can help you. That's what we specialize in, and that's why we're doing this LinkedIn Live, because we both believe in educating. It's the cornerstones of both of our businesses, and so that's the reason why we've come together to do this.
Definitely. And as we start to come to the end of our time together, do comment if you've got questions. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to message us directly, then feel free to do so. We will be responding to any more comments on LinkedIn after the event closes. But we do have exciting news. We are going to be doing another LinkedIn Live. Our next one's going to be on the 17th of April. If you can believe it or not, we're looking at April already. And it's on employee exits from the businesses and the data that surrounds that. The link, we're going to be sharing that towards the end of this week. So do bear with us, but make sure you do sign up, as of course we would love to see you back joining us for the next session on the 17th. Reach out to us if you've got any questions, anything that you want to talk through, and we'd love to hear your feedback as well. Thank you ever so much for everyone's time.
Thank you, and always a pleasure, Julie.
Always. Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye.